Well, we might as well start early, because normally we wait 5 minutes to see who might come late, but at this point it's just going to be a sad message for those people. The good news is, for those who didn't make it, and if you have friends who want to see this later, we are recording the talk, and so we'll make that available later on. But there is no substitute for in-person, and I am so honored. I'm going to give a much more formal introduction in just a bit. But I've learned that Professor Ziblatt tells me this is his very first public lecture since the pandemic began, to whatever phase we're in. End is not the word, but at least to be at this phase. And so it really is exciting and special to have this opportunity to be together for today. And that's my own seat, so I think maybe we're out of seats. Okay, you want to stand and have us? All right, this is your last seat right here. This is the one. This is the spirit of public inclusion that we do at the Reef Center and at William and Mary. I'd also like to say a couple of words of acknowledgement before we do the formal introduction. First, my great thanks go to all our veterans today on Veterans Day, and we celebrate your service, and thank you so much for what you do for our country and for the world. So please, a round of applause for all our veterans. Second, I gather my colleague in the government department, John McGlennon, who's a member of the James City County Board of Supervisors, is here tonight. And could Professor McGlennon please indicate where you are? There he is. Thank you too, sir, for your service to our community and to our university. I would also like to thank my colleagues in the government department for their support. Now let me move to tonight's event. As you know, Professor Daniel Ziblatt is one of the leading specialists on the fate of democracies in the world today. This lecture is part of a series. It is the Taylor-Ross Address on International Peace, which was established at the Reeve Center for International Studies to promote peace by exploring and investigating topics of current interest that affect relations among nations, ranging from international political matters to environmental questions. And recent speakers in this series have included last year Timothy Snyder from Yale, Ta-Nehisi Coates has been here, Anne-Marie Slaughter, and many other people who are quite prominent and eminent, as our current speaker is. It's also a lecture co-sponsored by the William and Mary Democracy Initiative, which some of you have read about in a recent piece we put on the William and Mary website, and which is co-directed by my wonderful colleague and friend, Carrie Cooper, the Dean of Libraries here. Carrie, could you quickly just show yourself there? That's Carrie. And I also want to thank the members of the Democracy Initiative Advisory Committee who've joined us tonight. I won't list all of them, but we're really grateful for the collaborations that we've had to build this initiative, which is really starting to shape up as something quite important. To give you a little bit more information about the Democracy Initiative, William and Mary is aspiring to be a place where respectful dialogue takes place on challenging topics. It's imperative for the future of our republic that we learn to advocate for the beliefs we are passionate about while having tolerance for the perspectives with which we disagree. At its core, our Democracy Initiative is about finding a path out of polarization through conversations that aren't about division or anger, but instead about bridging gaps. And with that kind of ethos in place, we're hoping our university will play a national and indeed maybe even a global role in figuring out ways to overcome these divides which are so debilitating. And we're going to learn a lot about perspectives on how to do that tonight. Finally, let me turn to the bio of our distinguished speaker. I've known him for a long time, and I guess I'll admit that we both went to the same graduate school for our PhD, UC Berkeley, and almost overlapped a bit, but got to know each other back in the 90s, so it's been a great, wonderful partnership and friendship. Professor Daniel Ziblatt is the Eaton Professor of the Science of Government at Harvard University, and since October 2020 is also the new director of the Transformations of Democracy Research Unit of the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. He has been awarded the 2019 Berlin Prize by the American Academy in Berlin and was the Carl W. Deutsch Visiting Professor at the WZB from 2019 to 2020. His book, co-authored with Stephen Levitsky, How Democracies Die, many of you read this book, is a New York Times bestseller. It has been already translated into over 15 languages. His book, Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy, from Cambridge University Press in 2017, an account of Europe's historical democratization, won the American Political Science Association's 2018 Woodrow Wilson Prize for the best book in government and international relations, and 3 other prizes, including the American Sociological Association's 2018 Barrington Moore Award for the best book in comparative historical sociology. I really recommend that book too for any of you who want a deeper dive into the really critical role of conservative political parties in channeling social interest into the defense of democracy. As I mentioned, Daniel Ziblatt received his PhD from the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, and his BA in German Studies and Politics as a double major, magna cum laude, from Pomona College. Without further ado, please join me in a warm William and Mary welcome for Daniel Ziblatt.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the invitation, for the kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, also for coming tonight, and to all of the co-sponsors for this event. I really appreciate the invitation. And I was just saying to Steve before coming up here that this is my first talk in public, and sort of have the feeling like this is the first day of school or something like that. So I've been teaching, but this is a kind of different scene. So I'm going to talk to you tonight and give some reflections on the state of American democracy. And I will be doing this in a way drawing on the book that I wrote, How Democracies Die, but really thinking beyond it and what I've learned since writing this book, How Democracies Die, which came out 4 years ago. And so as I do this, I'm going to be drawing on some new work that I've been doing with my co-author, Steve Levitsky, for a new book that we're writing. And so I think a good place to begin, though, in thinking about these issues is to kind of push you back to January of this year, January 2021. And to a 24-hour window between January 5th and January 6th. Because in that 24-hour window, we were presented with 2 dramatically clashing visions of what's happening in American political life. So on the evening of January 5th, you all may remember, an African American and a young Jewish American were elected to the Senate from the state of Georgia, and perhaps an unlikely state, a state of a history of reactionary Jim Crow. But the very next morning, less than 12 hours later, January 6th, a group of violent supporters of President Trump assaulted the U.S. Capitol building, culminating a 2-month effort to overturn the results of the 2020 election. So as contradictory as these 2 images might appear, they crystallize, I think, in a 24-hour window, really 2 real and deeply intertwined dynamics at the heart of American politics today. The election on January 5th showed that America's movement towards multiracial democracy is real. The assault on Congress on January 6th showed how exactly this movement has also triggered a radicalizing and dangerous authoritarian reaction. So this leaves American democracy today at a crossroads. So I want to make the case to you this evening that these 2 developments are actually interrelated, that our current crisis is rooted in a reaction against the prospect of a future multiracial democracy. But I'm also going to contend that our Constitution has become part of the problem, and that it's trapping us in a system that I think we might call minority rule. And I'll talk a bit more about that at the end. So let me begin with the first point, because I think in some ways it's underappreciated. The U.S. is undergoing an extraordinary transformation to multiracial democracy. So our definition, the definition of multiracial democracy that we use in some ways is quite simple. It's what democratic theorists would call a minimalist theory of democracy. Now, that is, modern democracy is a system with regular free elections in which all adults possess the right to vote, as well as basic civil liberties like freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom of speech, and so on. Now, multiracial democracy is simply a democracy in which those basic rights are universally protected across all ethnic groups. In other words, no individual from a single particular ethnic group suffers unequally. I mean, everyone's protected equally, essentially, of these same rights. Now, the U.S., of course, as we all know, on paper at least, became a multiracial democracy in the 1960s. But even today, there's plenty of evidence, as we all know, that we fall short. Black citizens, on average, live further away from polling stations than white citizens and have to wait longer in line to vote. A recent study found that residents of predominantly black neighborhoods were 74% more likely to have to wait for more than 30 minutes to vote than residents of predominantly white neighborhoods. African Americans are more likely to be the victims of police violence. They're more likely to be incarcerated and serve longer prison sentences for the same crimes. So individuals of all ethnic groups still do not enjoy equal rights and equal protection under the law. But multiracial democracy has become both more real and more consequential over the last half century. It's more real because the enforcement of civil rights and voting rights has improved considerably since the 1960s. And it's more consequential because American society has become much more diverse. So whereas whites constituted 84% of the US population in 1970, by 2020, they were 58%. Now, the consequences of this real multiracial democracy, this movement towards multiracial democracy, can also be seen on a couple of other dimensions. Consider the composition of the US Congress, for example. Since 1990, the number of non-white members of Congress has nearly tripled. And importantly, Black, Latino, Asian American politicians are increasingly getting elected in majority white districts. This rarely occurred 40 years ago. The movement towards multiracial democracy also can be seen in public opinion. For the first time, a pretty solid majority of Americans embrace racial diversity and support policies that enforce racial equality. In 1980, most Americans opposed laws that banned discrimination of home sales. Today, 80% of Americans support such laws. In the past, there were pretty solid majorities against affirmative action. Today, Gallup finds that more than 60% of Americans support affirmative action. Today, 60% of Americans say that America's diverse society makes American society a better place to live. So these numbers, I think, reflect two trends. Number one, the trend of the growing presence of non-whites in the American population. And number two, increasing racial acceptance among large segments of the white population of the United States. Now, this coalition of non-whites and what we might want to call racially liberal or racially tolerant whites have given rise to a multiracial democratic majority. These majorities may at times appear soft, but they suggest the outlines of a possible future. Not a perfect one, certainly one where racism and populism will rear its head from time to time, but one in which the basic features of political equality for individuals is attainable no matter the ethnic background. Now, underpinning this possible future for a multiracial democracy are two key norms, two unwritten rules that my co-author and I describe in our book, How Democracy's Done. The first is the norm of mutual toleration. This is basically the idea that you treat your rivals for power as rivals and not as enemies. We have to learn to treat those we disagree with, even passionately, on things that we care about passionately, with tolerance. This is absolutely critical for democracy. The second norm is one we call forbearance, by which essentially we mean self-restraint, the underutilization of power. Politicians often have incredible instruments of power at their disposal. Democracy requires sometimes stepping back from the brink. These two norms, these are unwritten rules of democracy, are critical for democracy. Combined with political equality, this offers promising terrain for a future of American democracy. But here's the problem. If the January 5th election gives us a glimpse into a possible multiracial democratic future, the events of January 6th suggest something different. In a future of extreme dysfunction, political violence, decline of mutual toleration, decline of forbearance, rise of destabilizing acts of contestation over the basic rules of democracy itself. Now, I'm going to admit something to you now, which is that this undemocratic future is something that my co-author and I, several years ago when we wrote our book, found outlandish. But I think this was a mistake. First of all, we underestimated the depth of the reaction against multiracial democracy. And second of all, we overestimated the capacity of our institutions to withstand that reaction. So these two phenomena, an intense authoritarian reaction on the one hand, and the vulnerability of our institutions on the other, fundamentally weaken and I think even potentially threaten our democracy. So I want to take each of these two in turn. So first, let me talk about the authoritarian reaction. Now, the events of January 6th, 2021 may have felt unprecedented to many Americans, but they weren't. Events like this, a violent assault on a main national parliament or Congress, have happened in other places and other times. Sometimes such assaults are successful, dislodging democratic leaders from power, but very often they're not. But whether or not such assaults are successful, absolutely critical and remarkably revealing about the health of a democracy is how establishment politicians and parties respond to such assaults. So question number one is, do establishment parties and politicians circle the wagons and unambiguously condemn the use of violence by their own allies to try to hold on to power, to gain power? Question number 2 is, do establishment parties and politicians unambiguously and unanimously insist that elections are the way to solve political disputes? Now, these are two fundamental benchmarks and bulwarks of democracy. Juan Linz, the great Spanish political scientist who often serves as a source of inspiration for me, who grew up in Spain during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, wrote a book back in 1978 called The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes. And he proposed these two questions that I just listed. Do politicians distance themselves from political violence? And do politicians accept elections unambiguously? He proposed these two questions as critical benchmarks to assess whether a politician or a political party is an authoritarian or not. Now, when thinking about these questions, Linz actually was quite a subtle thinker. And he made, I think, a powerful point. Because he noted that although it's really tempting to kind of break the world down into two types, Democrats and anti-democrats, defenders of democracy, assassins of democracies, Linz made the point, with lots of examples, that history is unfortunately not so neat. It's not so simple. History is often made by a third group that he called semi-loyalists. Semi-loyalists are those politicians and political parties that try to have it both ways. They say they're in favor of democracy in principle, but they turn a blind eye or even help their allies when they violate democratic rules and when they try to assassinate a democracy. So these types of individuals are often hidden in the shadows. They usually cover their tracks pretty well. But democracies die not just at the hands of explicit anti-democrats, but also with the aid of accomplices. These are Linz's semi-loyalists. So even though they're hard to see, in moments like January 6th, they are exposed. And so too, though, are the vulnerabilities of our democracy. Now let me explain what I mean with a couple of examples. So I want to talk to you first about France in 1934. So in 1934, France was Europe's oldest democracy. Steve has actually written a wonderful book on the origins of this regime in the 1870s and how this regime came into being. But in France, in February 1934, in the center of Paris, tens of thousands of young, angry men, veterans, many of them, members of right-wing and militia nationalist groups with names like the Young Patriots and the French Action, attempted to assault France's parliament. As members of parliament were inside. Now, late in the evening of February 6, 1934, tens of thousands of rioters threw chairs, metal grates, rocks, and used long poles with razor blades at their end to try to breach the parliamentary doors. Now, in this case, the Parisian police repelled them, but 15 victims were murdered on both sides. Hundreds were injured. Members of the French parliament had to sneak out the back door, frightened for their lives. The Liberal prime minister resigned the next day, but the regime appeared to survive. But even though it survived, just as critical is how the political establishment responded in the days following these events. Would it condemn unambiguously this assault on democracy? Those in the middle on the political left did, Republicans and socialists. Parliamentary investigatory committee was formed to investigate the events. One liberal member of the parliament told the committee the 6th of February was a revolt against the parliament, an attempt against the regime. President Lebrun, a moderate, who also testified to the committee, said the event was a, quote, assault against Republican institutions. Léon Blum, France's socialist prime minister after 1936, gave even more damning testimony to the parliamentary committee. And I'll quote from Blum. He says, I think there can be no doubt for anyone who was a witness to the events that day, but that the insurrection had within the parliamentary chamber both representatives and leaders. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed. The leader of France's main center-right party, the Republican Fédération, sat in the parliament that day, but some of them at least, were sympathetic to the protesters. They immediately dismissed the importance of the onslaught and even denied that there was really an attempt to overthrow the government. Other right-wing members of the political establishment went further, praising the insurrectionists for the attempt to save the republic. A vice president of this main center-right party, who was quite typical when he wrote of the veterans and nationalists who tried to breach the parliament, that they were, quote, and these are his words, martyrs who can never be sufficiently praised or honored. They have paid with their lives. The blood poured out on February 6, 1934, will be a seed of great national awakening. Another strand of right-wing press immediately began to claim that this is all a fake, false flag operation, and it was actually carried out by the left to try to discredit the right. Now, this split in views, this absence of a consensus, also got reflected in how historians wrote about these events. Some continue up through the 1950s and 60s to regard this event as a minor event. Others regard it as a major breakpoint, presaging the way for the fall of French democracy 5 years later. Now, I'm not going to resolve this historical dispute tonight, but what is notable is that many of the leading personalities of the Vichy regime that collaborated with the Nazis, set up in 1940, did play important roles in aiding and also supporting the insurrectionists, verbally at least, after the fact. So here's my point. France's political establishment responded to a major violent assault on what was with a total lack of consensus. The official establishment was split. The center-right refused unambiguously to condemn the political violence. The immune system of French democracy was thereby weakened. So on the eve of Germany's invasion in 1940, French democracy suffered what the historian Marc Bloch has called a strange defeat. It was polarized, weakened, and easily collapsed, even embracing the Nazi invasion. Now contrast this with what happened in Spain in 1981, another event. So the scene here, once again, is a parliament, but in this case, the Spanish parliament in Madrid. 1981. 5 years earlier, Spain had made a transition to democracy after 40 years of dictatorship. Between 1975 and 1981, Spain had lots of tumultuous years, massive inflation, terrorist attacks from Basque separatists. There was great uncertainty about what would come next, and the prime minister, a conservative center-right politician, Adolfo Suarez, was barely holding it together. His government was collapsing, his party was weak. So in February 1981, a new prime minister was being voted on in the Spanish parliament. And on February 23rd at 6:23 p.m. in the evening, as the votes were being counted for the new prime minister, and note it's always in moments of transitions where countries get into trouble, Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero entered the chamber with a pistol in his hand in an attempted coup. He climbed the speaker's rostrum, stood up in front of the chamber, and said, "No one move." The members of parliament were in shock. Some allies of Lieutenant Colonel came in with machine guns in their hands. They shot off bullets that are still in the ceiling of the Spanish parliament today. All of the members of parliament duck under their chairs, except for three. The outgoing conservative Prime Minister Adolfo Suarez, the Deputy Prime Minister General Gutierrez Malado, who is an old Francoist, and the communist leader Santiago Carrillo, who was the only other deputy to remain in his seat. Now the parliament and the prime minister were held hostage overnight. Troops gathered out in the streets. 1,800 allies of the soldiers inside the parliament carrying out the coup gathered with their tanks. Now, inside the king's palace in Madrid, Juan Carlos, who was a figurehead, who was not always the most admirable member of Spanish society, but was a moral authority, especially for the military. At 1:30 in the morning, he appeared on television and delivered a speech in which he called for the return to civilian rule. The insurgents had thought that the king would be on their side, but instead he sided with democracy, along with the main center-right politician, Suarez. The insurrectionists were now isolated, and the next morning, members of parliament were freed. The insurrectionists, now on the run, tried to escape out the back, second-floor back window of the parliament. Shortly after this, they were arrested, the coup was defeated, and this was a near-death experience for Spanish democracy. But Spanish democracy endured and has lasted ever since. Now, crucial to this story, though, is that the defeat of the coup became a founding myth of Spanish democracy. It came to be celebrated across the political spectrum as a moment when Spanish democracy had triumphed. In 2006, on the 25th anniversary of these events, the parliament, despite all of the differences within the parliament, issued a formal political statement, public statement, agreed to by all the parties, that the coup attempt had been, and I quote from the statement, the gravest attempt ever to forcefully violate freedoms and to abort the democratic process in Spain. So again, how political establishments respond to an effort to overturn an election and how it responds to political violence is both an indicator of democracy's health and a harbinger, possibly, of what's to come. Now, with this history in mind, when we turn back to the US, here's our concern. Between November 2020 and January 2021, America's right acted much more like France's right in 1934 than Spain's right in 1981. As we all know, for the first time in history, a sitting president refused to accept defeat and attempted to overturn the election. There was, as it has become clearer ever since, the days leading up to January 6th, an effort to overturn the election results. And rather than oppose this attempt, many Republicans, not all, but most, refused to publicly acknowledge Trump's defeat. So on January 6th, at the gathering of the House of Representatives, 2/3 of House Republicans voted against the certification. And in the aftermath of the events of January 6th, aside from a momentary series of condemnations immediately following the events, an alternative history is now actively being written. Leading Republicans had tried to block the creation of an independent commission. They have punished Republicans who appear open to the investigation. And Fox News and a big faction of the Republican establishment is attempting to write an alternative political history in which insurrectionists were heroes and arrested insurrectionists are political prisoners. It's because they were unwilling to accept the election results that they've also begun to be unwilling to unambiguously condemn political violence, all in violation of Linz's litmus test. Now, even those who don't fully and explicitly and repeatedly embrace the big lie, those who try to walk on both sides of the issue, talking out of both sides of their mouth, changing their tune depending on who their audience is, they're doing exactly what Juan Linz warned us about in 1978 in his book. They're behaving as semi-loyalists. And the problem is semi-loyalists, when they behave this way, can unwittingly kill a democracy. Now, how exactly? How would this happen in the United States? Well, I think what I fear most is not another attack on Congress. What I fear is that out of antipathy or indifference to democratic norms and a willingness as a result to twist the rules of the democratic game, that democracy can be threatened. So in How Democracies Die, Steve and I argued that our constitutional system, as I said before, relies on forbearance, that politicians deploy their institutional prerogatives with restraint. So they have to avoid what Harvard law professor Mark Tushnet calls constitutional hardball. But when politicians show an unwillingness to abide by election laws or tolerate or even praise political violence on their own side, we should worry about what they may try to do legally. I think we have to be alert to the possibility of another, but this time better organized and possibly legal attempt to steal an election. Now, remember, as I said, elections require lots of forbearance. But in most democracies, elections are administered by independent election authorities. US elections are run by partisan officials. Partisan officials are more prone to constitutional hardball, especially in the context of intense polarization. So if politicians show that they're indifferent to democratic norms, it's really easy to imagine them using the letter of the law to violate the spirit of democratic elections. Now, election experts who know a lot more about this than I do warn about two different avenues through which this could happen. First, one can think about the vote counting process. Election officials can throw out ballots based on minor technicalities, like failing to fill in an oval completely, or failing to have a perfect signature match. Now, these kind of pretty petty ballot disqualifications may conform to the letter of the law, but it can be profoundly anti-democratic because you're annulling people's right to vote, or people's votes. And if electoral kind of hardball criteria are used unevenly so that many ballots are disqualified in one party's stronghold but not the others, it can turn an election. Now, what we see across many states, as probably many of you know, many bills in state legislatures trying to lay the legal and administrative groundwork to engage in this kind of electoral hardball, justified often by the laudable sounding goal of cleaning up elections. Now, these measures allow state legislators or election boards to sideline or override election administrations in opposition strongholds. So this is really a problem. The second avenue through which elections are at threat, I would say, according to election experts, is the process of ascending electors to the Electoral College. This process is governed by a 19th century act called the Electoral Count Act, which allows state legislators to send alternative slates of electors in the case of a failed election. This was originally intended to cover kind of natural disasters, but it could also be interpreted to mean any contested election, including those marked by baseless accusations of fraud. So one can imagine a situation where state legislatures send an alternative slate of electors. Now, and this then throws it to the Congress and the House of Representatives, and given that Republicans will certainly control a majority of state delegations, and given what we experienced on January 6th, there's some reason to think that they will back the Republican candidate, no matter who actually won the election. Now, these are all worrying prospects. Perhaps this all won't come to pass, but there's much more than a small risk, I think, that it will. Now, if this turn to semi-loyalty were the only thing happening in America today, I wouldn't be so worried. In most democracies, electoral majorities govern. And as I said before, after all, a majority, relatively soft, but somewhat solid majority of Americans favors multiracial democracy. The authoritarian reaction is not the majority of Americans. But I think the problem is that America's new multiracial democratic majority has hurled itself against some of the world's most powerful countermajoritarian institutions. So what are countermajoritarian institutions? Countermajoritarian institutions dilute the power of majorities. Now, of course, in some sense, that's the purpose of countermajoritarian institutions, the Bill of Rights, supermajority rules in the legislature, judiciaries with strong judicial review powers, federalism, all limit the power of majorities. Now, if many of you are probably like me, you think that some countermajoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. In a liberal democracy, majorities must be constrained. Basic civil liberties must be protected, and parties must be prevented from using temporary majorities to entrench themselves in powers to pass laws against the political opposition. So that's all correct. But countermajoritarian institutions can also be a problem if they establish a minority veto. Institutions of minority veto empower partisan minorities at the expense of majorities. So some examples include supermajority rules like the filibuster, unelected bodies, let's say, like to restrict the authority of elected governments, whether it's a monarchy, military, or Supreme Court with really strong judicial review powers and lifetime appointments. But not all, so in this sense, I would say minority veto institutions are not essential to democracy. In fact, they are arguably antithetical to democracy because they power minorities at the expense of electoral majorities. Now, you might think, well, why would ever such institutions be adopted in a democracy? Well, historically, these kinds of institutions often emerge out of a political pact that accompanies a difficult transition, one in which some powerful minority actor credibly threatens to undermine the transition if not given special protections. So examples include small and some slaveholding states in the United States, Pinochet and the military in Chile in the 1980s, the communists in Poland in 1989, the Afrikaners in South Africa in the early 1990s. Now, most democratizing cases, these kind of undemocratic measures are temporary, either by design, as in South Africa, or in practice, as in Chile. They're basically transitional mechanisms, a brief leg up for existing power holders to induce them to play the democratic game. But in the United States, these kinds of minority veto institutions have endured. These include indirect presidential elections, which permits losers of the popular vote to win the office, severely malapportioned Senate, which provides equal representation to all states, regardless of population, and the Senate filibuster, of course, which wasn't at the founding, but was created shortly thereafter, that allows 41 senators to permanently block legislation backed by a majority, a Supreme Court with strong judicial review and lifetime tenure, and highly supermajoritarian rules for changing the Constitution. Now, many Americans think these institutions are essential to democracy. Maybe some of them are. But they are also products of a pre-democratic era, when ideas like universal suffrage were still widely rejected. By 18th and 19th century standards, the US Constitution was pretty democratic, more democratic than many other countries. But over time, other countries have shed these pre-democratic institutions. Britain weakened the House of Lords, stripping of its veto power. Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Portugal, Greece, Taiwan got rid of their upper houses altogether. Germany, Canada, Australia, Belgium, Mexico democratized their upper houses, making them more proportional to population. Germany, Portugal, Switzerland, France imposed term limits on Supreme Court justices. United Kingdom, Canada, Sweden, Denmark, New Zealand, Australia, Belgium, Spain established a retirement age for judges. And every other presidential democracy on earth got rid of its electoral college. France eliminated its electoral college in 1962. Brazil got rid of its electoral college in 1988. Argentina got rid of its electoral college in 1994. So other democracies have become more majoritarian over the last century, eliminating these kinds of pre-democratic institutions that allowed electoral minorities to thwart majorities. They did this through constitutional change. Now, most democracies rewrote their constitutions in the 20th century. And here again, the United States is an outlier. We are the only presidential democracy on earth without direct elections. We have the most malapportioned Senate in the world except for Argentina and Brazil. And to my knowledge, No other democracy allows a parliamentary minority to permanently veto legislation backed by the majority. And we are the only democracy, one of the only democracies in the world, with lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. Even within the United States, many states at the state level don't have retirement ages or term limits for state Supreme Court justices. And our Constitution, of course, is the world's hardest to change. So among democracies, the US is uniquely countermajoritarian. None of this is new, of course. Rural areas have always been overrepresented in US politics. The US has always been highly countermajoritarian, but two developments in the 21st century have changed the dynamics and made these institutions more of a threat to democracy. The first is a transformation of the party system. So as I said, the US system has always overrepresented rural areas, the Electoral College, the Senate, and so on, but it has never had a partisan effect because for most of American history, the two parties were evenly distributed across urban and rural areas. So it's only in the 21st century, though, that as our parties have become split up along geography, that Democrats are primarily a party of metropolitan areas, and Republicans are mostly a party of rural areas. And this means the Republicans now have a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, the Senate, and because the President nominates the Supreme Court justice and the Senate confirms it, also in the Supreme Court. This allows Republicans to hold power without winning national elections. And so I think, in a sense, our Constitution is undermining electoral competition because it's skewing the game in favor of one party. Just to give you a little bit of evidence here, Republicans have won the popular vote for the presidency just once in the last 20 years, yet they've controlled the presidency 12 of those 20 years. The current Senate is split 50-50, although Democrats represent 40 million more voters than Republicans. And of course, the filibuster prevents Senate majorities from doing anything unless they have 60 votes. This is what we can think of as minority rule. The minority rule has also affected, I would say, the Supreme Court. Now, minority rule is bad enough, but it's made worse by the second 21st century development, and that is the transformation, as I've described, of large segments of the Republican Party into a semi-loyal political actor. So our counter-majoritarian institutions aren't just empowering a minority party, they're empowering an increasingly dangerous faction of that minority party. Now, this combination of counter-majoritarianism and this faction of authoritarianism have begun to interact, I think, in pernicious ways. And I think we see this in the reaction to the January 6th events. So the rise of multiracial democracy then has triggered an authoritarian reaction among a partisan minority, and our Constitution is empowering that partisan minority, which has magnified rather than checked the authoritarian reaction. We are trapped, in a sense, by our own institutions. So where do we go from here? Steve said I would offer some answers to that. That's much more difficult. One lesson, and I think this is a perfect place to say this, is that, at least on this matter, Thomas Jefferson may have been right. Constitutions need to change. The idea that institutions drawn up in the 18th century are by definition the best practice across time and across all historical contexts is silly and dangerous. Institutions that work well in one context may be dangerously dysfunctional in another context. Our constitutional system, after all, was designed for a world without political parties. The Constitution never mentions the word political party. And it worked reasonably well in a context of highly decentralized, undisciplined, and non-ideological parties. But it doesn't work as well in a context of disciplined parties and extreme polarization. It may be fatal when parties are polarized on urban and rural lines. Other democracies have changed their constitution frequently. So I would say the US is in desperate need of institutional reform. We need to entrench voting rights. I would argue we need to replace the Electoral College with direct presidential elections, eliminate the filibuster, democratize the Senate, that's a very steep hill to climb, and reform the Supreme Court. But our Constitution, as I said, is exceedingly difficult to reform. I'm not naive about this. But it is true that our most important constitutional changes in our history, think of the second founding in the 1860s, 1870s, think of the progressive reforms of the early 20th century, think of the quasi-constitutional reforms of the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. These happen when politicians and judges face organized, peaceful, social movements that alter the calculations of politicians and judges. A similar break maybe seems unlikely today, and yet we must get this issue of constitutional reform, I would say, on the agenda. But remember, political change is often this kind of change is often thought to be impossible, but it's also true that political change is about making what seems impossible at some point appears to suddenly be inevitable. So I noted at the outset that our democracy stands at a crossroads, and it is true that this may be a generational crossroads, meaning it's not something that's not going to change overnight. But I think at the end of the day, America will either be a multiracial democracy in the 21st century, or it won't be a democracy. Thank you. Yeah.
Since there's only one mic, I'm sneaking in here. So if we could have some questions and answers, I'm sure that Professor Ziblatt would be happy to answer them. I would just ask two things. One is make sure that you actually ask a question. And the second one is the spirit of civic disagreement. So if you vehemently disagreed, as we heard earlier, it's vital to democracy. You express everything in a respectful manner. So with that introduction, Dan, you want to take your own questions?
Sure.
And, yeah, sounds good.
Wow. You guys are like my undergraduates. I mean, no offense to the undergraduates. These are my undergraduates, not the undergraduates here are obviously very different. Yes?
So you mentioned a couple of alternatives, one of which was to democratize the Congress, presumably democratizing the Senate.
Yeah.
And one of which was eliminating the electoral college. Which of those two would you consider to be, one, more important, and two, more possible?
Yeah, I think yeah. So what would be more possible, to change the filibuster, or to democratize eliminate the electoral college? Certainly, democratizing. I mean, getting rid of the filibuster is much easier. It doesn't require a constitutional change. There's nowhere in our Constitution. It's a Senate rule that could be changed at any point. I mean, I think there's lots of good arguments historically for why we have a filibuster. Slow down the decision-making process, increase cooperation across the parties. But the norms around the filibuster have changed dramatically. I mean, throughout the 20th century, they were used about once per Senate session. Now they're used 30 times at least it's normal, regular business. And so you know, I think in our book, How Democracies Die, we actually argued against changing the filibuster in the sense of like, we want to defend our norms. This is an old institution. Maybe it's worth defending. But I think because the institution itself has changed, we're no longer defending the institution as it previously existed. So this would be the easiest thing to do. Reforming the Electoral College is very, very difficult because it requires constitutional change, so which requires 2/3 vote and requires all the states to agree to it, and so it's a much more difficult thing. So I think, my sense is that the filibuster, the way it'll probably change is kind of incrementally, as is already happening, sort of carve-outs being created to make our Senate decision-making more effective. I mean, one example that looms in my mind often, this is an extreme example, Steve probably knows about this, the Polish liberum veto, which was this rule in the Polish Senate in the 17th century that all members of the Polish parliament, who were all aristocrats, had to unanimously agree to any decision. And this was not some crazy idea. This was, Rousseau talked about this. There's the Republican theorists that this is the best way to protect ourselves against the usurping powers of monarchs. We need to all be unanimous, and there was a big Republican elaborate theory about this. But as they sat around blocking any bits of legislation that came through, Russia invaded, Austria invaded, Prussia invaded, and every time they tried to raise money to raise an army to fight against them, they couldn't agree, because all you had to do was buy off one guy, the Russians, the Austrians, and the Prussians. And so by the 18th century, Poland no longer existed. So I think in a way, so the point of that story, again, that's an extreme story, is that some of these parliamentary practices take on this higher significance. We have to step back from time to say, is this really the kind of institution we really want to defend? And so again, I think that's the easier one to change. Thank you. I think somebody had there. Yes?
Okay, my question was a bit similar to that. If the filibuster was maybe the easiest to change, is there another institutional change that you would say is more imperative above the others?
In addition to the filibuster, you're saying?
Like, if we were only to be able to change one thing,
yeah.
What would you choose?
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that, well, again, we have to balance what's desirable and what's feasible, so I think that's one way of trying to make these evaluations. And I think the idea of term limits for the judiciary strike me as pretty reasonable. Actually, I mean, if we look at those, I mean, part of the research we've been doing is looking at other countries and the reforms that other countries have carried out. And when you look at that, you see that that's a pretty commonsensical thing. The fact that this already happens in US states and civilization hasn't come to an end. Right before the talk, I know in California, where I'm originally from, they have term limits. And so right before I came up here, I wanted to check out what happens in Virginia. And I guess in Virginia, there's no legal requirement of term limits, but that there's a kind of informal set of arrangements among state Supreme Court justices that there's a 2-term limit. So, this strikes me as being, and now, so why would this be so important? I think there's a couple of reasons why this is important. One, you need a strong judiciary to enforce civil liberties, that's certainly right. But there's a kind of intertemporal bargain that gets struck so that, if you have people appointed, it's majorities from 40 years ago that are determining decisions today. And, and I think I could, there's some of the proposals I've heard, I could imagine being quite useful, in fact. So one proposal I've heard is that sort of like professors who become emeritus professors, there should be emeritus Supreme Court justices. They get to still come into the office, wear their robe, give tours to kids, weigh in as, and I mean, that sounds like a joke, but weigh in as public authorities on contested questions of the day without being in a position of making decisions. Inform the public about and so you could imagine this being a kind of graceful exit for people leaving the Supreme Court justice instead of, staying on till the bitter end. So this is something that I could imagine. But in terms of what would be particularly desirable, I mean, I think the Electoral College result, some kind of change of that system is also probably justified.
What in the far back?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not, yeah.
Far back in the middle of the
Hi. Okay. How feasible do you think any of these changes would be without changing the sort of like lobbying corporate interest part of American politics? Because I think that although like the Democratic and Republican parties like pretend they disagree on a lot, they do end up agreeing on what their corporate backers want them to think. And I feel like stuff wouldn't be able to change unless you get corporate influence out of politics.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the question. I do think that, I think big money's influence in politics is by definition undemocratic in the sense that it gives some people more political voice than others, and so it's a violation of a basic principle of political equality. So I agree with that. I'm not sure if, I guess one point, I think in some ways in terms of defending democracy, and I think also in terms of specific kinds of public policies, I agree with you as well, that may run counter to an economic interest with somebody who has real access. So whether one's talking about pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies dealing with prices, with negotiating over prices with Medicare, or health insurance companies and kind of trying to block efforts to reform the healthcare system. In terms of policy, I agree with you as well. I'm not as fully convinced that large corporate interests in the United States, as they currently are unambiguously bad for democracy, in the sense of kind of allowing preventing a kind of autocrat from coming to power. I mean, I think one of the strengths of and this may be maybe a controversial view, but I think one of the strengths of the American system is a very pluralistic society. And so what that means is that we have lots of economic interests, we have a well-organized civil society, and one of the things that's very hard to imagine, if we compare this to, let's say, Hungary, where Viktor Orban appoints all his buddies heads of companies and very quickly can assert political control. I think one of the things that's pretty striking is that business in the United States is quite independent. Now, I think there's circumstances in which this has a negative impact on policy, but on the other hand, companies respond to often what consumers want as well. And so when there was efforts to kind of overturn the election in Georgia, corporate interests spoke up. And so, not to say that corporate interests are the heroes, but in some ways they respond to often what consumers want. And so there's a channel through which these kinds of interests can be mobilized to help defend democracy. And I think the Democratic coalition has to encompass both business, the Chamber of Commerce, and labor unions, religious groups and the Chamber of Commerce, and of all back. So I think the broader the coalition, the better. And so my sense, though, is that in terms of these particular institutional reforms, it's not clear to me that corporate interests are against these institutional reforms. I think above all, corporate interests, economic interests like political stability. And the thing I'm most worried about is political stability. If we have a stolen election in 2024, it's pretty naive to think that people are just going to take this lying down. I mean, in the same way that they're on the Republican side, people who thought that the election was stolen, they took action. If the same thing happens again in the other direction, we'll see political instability, is my fear. And I don't think any wise, prudent economic interest should favor that scenario. So we need to encourage, I think, economic interests to recognize that democracy is in their interest. Let me get another voice in here. Yes?
Let's wait for the mic. We can get the mic in. Just because we're waiting for the mic because the recording is on and no one will hear the question if the mic isn't there.
Sorry. I'll try to call on people that are standing close to you. So you can, yes, thank you.
How big of a role do you think that social media like Facebook and the spreading of misinformation has in the rise of this semi-loyalism?
Yeah, I think it's, again, this is something that I probably underestimated. I mean, the political science, I was following maybe too closely the political science research, which, people do these kinds of experiments where they'll pay respondents to only look at news they agree with and on both sides, and what you see, over a 6-month period is some slight movement to the edges so people get slightly more radicalized. And so at kind of first glance, over a couple of years ago, I would have said, it's one factor, it's not the factor. It accelerates a lot of these deeper trends. I think it is more pernicious, and I think in many ways part of why it has such a negative effect is more broadly you have the decline of kind of traditional media institutions who serve as gatekeepers. And one of the things, people maybe don't like CNN and MSNBC, and that's, I understand that frustration, but that's media, that's not journalism. Journalism is a profession and journalists abide by a professional ethos where they pursue the truth, they get opinions from other sides, and that is critical for a democracy. And my concern is with the decline of that, the impact of that as a filter mechanism, we're then confronted with all sorts of misinformation. So I think many network, cable news is as much of a problem as social media in many instances. So, but all of that said, I think the deeper trends driving this are sociological. I think that the media is in some ways exacerbating the problem and accelerating the problem, but it's also reflecting these deeper demographic and cultural and political changes that are taking place in society. So I think, again, it's an accelerant, not the primary cause. I'll let you just choose people if that's okay.
I have a microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yes, here.
Hi. So do you think that under the current political party system that we have with Democrats and Republicans being a two-party system, that the kinds of reformation you're talking about, such as the elimination of the Electoral College or the elimination of the filibuster system in the Senate, is possible? Or do you think we would have to reform the two-party system in order for such changes to take place?
Well, I think some of the changes that I think, and if we were starting from scratch, I would say we'd probably have, and it would be desirable to have a multi-party system with all sorts of constraints built in. So I teach a course, I'm teaching a course right now on the history of European politics, and I spent some time on the collapse of Weimar, and you had a highly proportional system which led to a highly fragmented political system. But the post-war German model was one in which you get to both vote for a candidate, like the US, and vote for the party, so it's a sort of mixed system. I have a cockapoo at home, which is a Cocker Spaniel and a poodle, which is supposed to be the best, perfectly designed hybrid species because it's friendly, but it doesn't shed. That's like the German electoral system. I mean, it's a kind of hybrid. It's the cockapoo of electoral systems, and it's a multi-party system. Now, these systems have their own problems and so on. I mean, the cockapoo has its problems too. But I think ideally we'd start there. But it's very hard to imagine moving in that direction because just as with all of these other institutional reforms, parties are going to vote against reforms that put themselves out of business or give competition. That said, there are reforms underway, though. I mean, I think, and this takes place at the state level. And so in a lot of states, there's pushes to introduce ranked order voting, for instance. I mean, that's something I would encourage people to look into. The state of Maine has this for its elections. A referendum in Massachusetts, last election cycle lost, but there was a push for that. And so I think this is a kind of, and the idea of a ranked order voting system, in principle, is more proportional and might lead to more parties. So I think that's one of the institutional reforms. I wouldn't say that's a precondition. I don't think we need to wait until we get those kinds of reforms. We've had major constitutional reforms in the past when you have a two-party system. Now, for those who think this all sounds like a naive dream about these kinds of reforms, I mean, I understand the concern, but one example I would point to is that the US Senate, until the beginning of the 20th century, senators were appointed. They were not directly elected. The Constitution was changed, a constitutional amendment was passed in which you now have the direct election of senators. Now, what's so striking about that example is that you had to get senators who had been appointed to vote for themselves to have to get elected. And so these were guys who were essentially voting themselves out of, eliminating the channel through which they got to power. So, I think how did that happen? Part of the way that happened is that there was such massive social pressure and so many corruption scandals that it became obvious that this, I use this phrase again, it had looked impossible, but it became inevitable. It was like kicking down a rotten door at the point at which it passed. So I think some of these reforms can change, are difficult, but I don't think we have to wait for one in order to carry out the other.
So you've mentioned the role that popular peaceful protests play in instituting reform. We saw in 2020 some of the most widespread peaceful protests in the United States history through Black Lives Matter, and recently in this 2021 election, we saw police reforms fail in many of the major metropolitans where these protests were taking place. Do you see a specific reason why these protests in particular failed, or why maybe in the United States widespread peaceful protests haven't formed towards these constitutional changes yet, despite large outcry?
Yeah, very good question. I don't think I have a totally satisfying answer. I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter movement was a very impressive movement because it was so broad. I mean, that's the first thing I would say. These movements have to be broad. They can't, meaning cross-class, cross-ethnicity, cross-generation. And in many ways, the Black Lives Matter movement fit that bill, I would say. That's one of the things that made it so impressive. So I don't know. I think you should invite somebody to come talk about that, because I don't think I have the answer to that. I mean, one thing, though, thinking about other moments of change that have happened is that these movements also have to be linked, and I'm not saying that Black Lives Matter was not this way. These movements have to be linked to existing civic associations that have real organizational muscle. So whether one's talking about labor unions, chambers of commerce, one has to be linked to politicians. And so, it's one thing to have, and maybe Black Lives Matter does fit this bill, I mean, to some degree, but that to me is something that I would expect increases the likelihood of success. And so you have broad coalitions that are organized. It's not enough. I mean, that's sort of one of the points here. Is it's not enough that 60% of Americans think, have some progressive view on something. I mean, just mass opinion doesn't get you anywhere. I mean, what really gets you somewhere is hard work, organization, lots of setbacks, coalitions with people you disagree with on lots of other things. That's, in fact, one of the most difficult things to deal with. So instead of viewing somebody from the other side who seems to be a sellout and compromising, realizing people are making sacrifices when they join coalitions, both sides of any coalition. I mean, if you weren't making sacrifices, you wouldn't have to form a coalition. You'd already be on the same team, right? So I think this is the kind of work that just has to keep, you have to keep at it. And so that's in some ways, that's in some, I guess, my general theory of this. Why this hasn't worked so far, maybe others would dispute that it hasn't been successful. Certainly change the public debate, which is an important first step.
Going back to the 24-hour comparison that you began with, how do you think this increasingly more multiracial democracy will change the nature of politics in the future?
Well, I see, as I said, in a way, I see two sides to this. I mean, one, that this shouldn't be a partisan issue. I mean, I think that currently we have a situation in which one party is predominantly white and the other party is a collection of all sorts of other ethnic groups. And I think that's a dangerous situation. Steve mentioned I wrote a book on conservative parties, and so I think conservative parties are essential for democracy. You need to have constitutional conservative parties. Any stable democracy has had constitutional parties that play by the rules of the right and of the left on both sides. And so what I think the Republican Party needs to do is become a more diverse party. And in some ways you might say we've seen some signs of this, but it's pretty much at the margins. So I think one thing that a kind of successful multiracial democracy would be one in which both parties are competing for votes across all ethnicities. And I think if one had that, ultimately, one would have a more stable political system. So, that's not inevitable that will happen, but I think that that's necessary in order for democracy to be stable. On the other hand, I think there is this other path through which there's a kind of increasing kind of bunker mentality in which, there's no effort to reach out to other voters. And I think multiracial democracy, in that kind of scenario, I mean, one of the things, again, kind of thinking about history is that often when parties think that they have no chance of winning fair and square, that's when they cheat. There's sort of two conditions necessary in order to accept a loss. Number one, that you think you can win again in the future. And number two, that you think that the loss that you're about to suffer is not going to completely destroy your way of life. There's lots of examples in history of political parties who, because of those two concerns, have turned against democracy. So I think embracing multiracial democracy so that it's not regarded as an existential threat, and also embracing multiracial democracy so that you can compete to win, is critical for democracy to be stable. You outthought it, I think.
I think I just didn't wait long enough.
Yeah.
Yes, Dan, I'm taking the chair's privilege to ask a question, and I will preface this by saying I have no idea what the answer is, and I'm hoping for political science guidance for my own work.
Yeah.
So you talk a lot in the first book with Steve about norms and the importance of norms that are informal for being kind of guardrails of not going too far with zero-sum struggle, forbearance, as you say. And yet, as we've seen with the filibuster, as we just discussed, sometimes those arguments for norms start to be stale or not very, up to date, and even naive, right? You get to a point where someone says, well, that's the norm of the Senate. I'm not getting, you told me norms were important.
Right.
Now you want me to cast aside the very guardrails that you said in your previous book were important.
Yeah.
So what kind of person are you? And I ask that not as a challenge in that way, but what do we say to such people? Because the hard part is figuring out what are the empirical indicators of the timing, right? How do you know empirically, not just as a gut instinct, that the time has come to abandon a norm and retreat maybe, or maybe advance to principle, which is different from norms, right? It's an articulation of something eternal, something that we believe is true and worth defending regardless of circumstance, which is different from the norm.
Yeah, very difficult question. But a simple answer would be that when one side is not abiding by the norm, then it's no longer a norm. And when only one side is playing by the rules, it's no longer a rule. It's just a trap for yourself. And so I think that's one consideration. The indicator of judging when something is, one side is no longer playing by the rule is trickier. I mean, that's more of a judgment call because, the world's never black and white. I mean, there's always some people abiding by the rules, still others not. But I think actually a second, maybe more nuanced indicator, because people forget that norms are not just a set of rules. Norms are a set of rules that when you deviate from the norms, you pay a price for it. You get punished. Somebody thinks, you don't get punished, you don't go to jail. Somebody wags their finger at you. They shake their head at you. Now, if somebody wags their finger at you and shakes their head at you, and you go, whatever, then that's not much of, and nobody's abiding by it any longer, then that's not much of a norm. So if there's no price to be paid, that means the norm's dead. In my sense with the filibuster is there's no price to be paid. There's no electoral price. There's no, voters aren't voting people out of office, and so the norm is dead. And so in a sense, I think that's at the point when once the norm is dead, you don't just say, well, that's it, time to move on. When the norm is dead, when the soft guardrail is broken, you have to harden the guardrails. You need to have new set of rules. So to give you an example, Franklin Roosevelt, there was this norm, George Washington established a norm, two-term presidency. There was lots of very ambitious presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, people who would have loved to have run for a third term, a fourth term. Nobody ever even tried to do it. And it wasn't because there was a written rule, it's because there was this norm established by George Washington. Now, when Roosevelt came along and broke that norm, demolished the norm, and was president for 4 terms, in 1952, the thing that happened was not, or 51 after Roosevelt died, was not to say, it's not as if Republicans at that point said, well, hey, there's this norm, we have to keep abiding by the norm. No, that would have been insane. Instead, what they do is they pass a constitutional amendment, harden the guardrail, say, okay, now there's a rule, 2 terms. So you transform the soft norm into a hard rule. I guess it's more of a judgment call, and one would have to think more kind of in a harder way about, when the degradation has reached a kind of tipping point, and that's a hard call to make. But I think it is possible, A, when one side's not following the rules, and B, they're not paying a price for breaking the rules.
If our democracy were to follow the same trajectory as the French one after their coup, what are some events or instances or changes that you would expect to happen in the near future?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so what happened after 1934 in France, one of the reasons why I think France is very interesting to think about, and Steve is really expert on this, but is that France was, unlike, let's say, Weimar Germany that everybody talks about, is that France was a stable democracy. It had been around since the 1870s, at least as a stable regime, the Third Republic. And so as a result of that, at the time that all this stuff was happening that I described, people, the same debates that are happening now, which is, people were saying these guys are fascists. And, long historical debates have followed ever since saying, there's this immunity thesis that France is immune from fascism because of the French Revolution. And, we can't have fascism in this country. That's not possible. And that kind of reminds me of the debates about fascism in the United States. This is something that happened in Germany and Italy, but in our country, never. And so I think part of that unreality or unwillingness to confront events is partly, maybe justified because there's a longer tradition of democracy. Now, what happened, that wasn't your question. That was all background. To answer your question, what happened after 1934 was that the center, what they were called the radicals, but they were really liberals, and socialists who had been kind of at loggerheads, finally understood how serious this was. So this is kind of the center left. Finally said, we better get along because we're confronting this very, very dangerous threat. And so they formed the Popular Front, which was a broad socialist left government. So that, in some sense, sounds very promising. But I think showing you the weakness of only having a coalition of from the center to the left, the right remained radical and anti-democratic. And so 4 years later, so even though you had this broad, optimistic coalition, it didn't, it basically didn't last. There's this question of what happened in 1940. There was a German invasion. One might say this had nothing to do with the weakness of French democracy. But my sense is that there were these elements within French society, these radical right elements, which welcomed the Nazi invasion. And so, I'm not saying that the U.S. will be invaded, but all I'm saying is that if you have a broad coalition of only Democrats on one side of the aisle and not on the other, where you can't actually even have an alternation in power because you're so afraid of what the other party is going to do when it gets into power, that means you're in a very bad situation. And it just means that the kind of threshold or the consequences of making a mistake are that much higher. So I would say that the thing that needs to happen, using that as an example, is that it's great to have a strong center-left coalition, but that's not enough. There needs to also be a strong center-right, a democratic center-right coalition.
So I wanted to ask, so as individuals, what are some of the important things that we can do if we want to help protect democracy?
Yeah, very good question. My neighbor, I live in Newton, Massachusetts, and my neighbor asked me this question once. And I said, well, you should join like the ACLU. And she goes, what do you mean? I've been a member of the ACLU for 30 years. Why tell me something I don't know? So I won't say that. But what I do think is an underappreciated power that people have, students, but also professionals, lawyers, civil servants, doctors, public health authorities, journalists, is that everybody, when you're a professional, there's a professional ethos and often a formal set of professional guidelines that govern your behavior. And you can't be a lawyer and you'll be kicked out of the bar association. If you're a doctor and you do something unethical, you face severe consequences. And so I think actually doing your job in an ethical way is kind of simple as that sounds, is an incredible strength of a civil society and a democracy. Because one thing that authoritarians don't like is an autonomous realm where, if an authoritarian tells a lawyer to write a memo saying torture these guys, and you say, no, I can't do that. That's against my ethical code. Or a public health authority, or, let's take an example, the National Weather Service. I think at some point there was some effort to say that the hurricane was going somewhere, saying, no, we're not this. Look, as a scientist, I can't alter the data. Public health authorities, I can't alter the data. This is an incredible, and it sounds simple, but it's incredibly, power is seductive, and it takes a lot of courage to resist political pressure and the temptations of access to political power. There's all sorts of rationalizations that take place. I mean, in your everyday work life, people have hard decisions to make, but I think actually this is an underappreciated power that individuals have in their own professional lives.
And I think this will have to be the last question. So I think I saw one maybe in the back. Yeah, there, that gentleman.
First off, thank you very much for coming this evening. My question, if the threats to American democracy are as serious as you say they are, how can we treat the authoritarian elements as rivals and not as enemies?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, this is the core dilemma of tolerance, mutual tolerance. I mean, the norm of mutual tolerance assumes that your rivals are playing by the democratic rules. This is, Karl Popper called this the paradox of tolerance, which is, do you have to tolerate the intolerant? One part of the answer is in the word tolerance itself. Tolerance doesn't mean embracing things necessarily. It doesn't mean accepting things. It means essentially accepting things that you actually don't really like. Actually, our old advisor, Ken Jowett, once defined tolerance as publicly accepting what you privately despise. That's the best we can hope for. Or that may be enough. Now, other democracies have dealt with this, and I'll try to make my answer brief here, but other democracies have dealt with this dilemma, like in Germany after 1945, facing exactly this dilemma by allowing for a judicial process where you can actually ban the opposition if they're a threat to democracy. Nazi parties can be banned, Mein Kampf can be banned, and so on. So this is the notion of militant democracy. That's one solution. A second solution is what I would say a kind of broad containment solution, which is that all the advocates of democracy simply have to figure out how to win elections. I would say the third solution, and the one that in some sense I embrace, is a kind of competition solution. You just have to win and hope. I mean, that the kind of logic of democratic competition, like the logic of a marketplace, is if one side keeps losing over and over and over, if a baseball team keeps losing, you come up with a new strategy, you fire the manager. If a political party keeps losing, eventually people will come to their senses and abandon this dangerous path. The reason this is not, so that's the theoretical solution. You compete, you beat the other side, you win, and the other side comes to its senses. One additional reason why I think there's a case to be made for reforming our Constitution is that we're now in a situation in which one party can lose over and over but still hold on to power because of the tilt of our political system. So what this means is that our constitutional system, in a sense, is distorting competition to not allow this kind of magic of competition to work. But I think on a day-to-day basis, we have to reach out to people who are on the other side who are not authoritarian and try to help them out and encourage them, and you have to win at the end of the day. So I mean, that's not fully satisfying answer, but I think this in some ways is the biggest dilemma ultimately that we face today. And when you're in that situation, there's no easy answers.
Well, on that note of no easy answers, I will add that we're going to have an opportunity here in the Commonwealth of Virginia to experience the peaceful transfer of power from one party to the other, and so we'll have a chance to hone our skills on either side. And we really appreciate, Daniel, the great mind-opening approach that you've taken, bringing all the comparative and historical examples in, and then reflecting on where we are. So I know you all feel the same way. Please join me in thanking Daniel Ziblatt.